Sarah Mitchell knelt in the frozen earth, her breath forming clouds in the bitter Montana air as she drove another wooden stake into the ground with nothing but a rock and sheer determination. 7 months pregnant, fingers numb with cold, she refused to stop building what everyone said was impossible, a school for the forgotten children of Cedar Falls. What happened when the richest man in 3 counties discovered her vision would change everything, but not in the way anyone expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the pine trees that surrounded Cedar Falls like ancient sentinels, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter storm. Sarah Mitchell pressed her hand against the small of her back and straightened slowly, every movement deliberate and careful. The abandoned lot where she stood had been nothing but weeds and broken bottles 3 weeks ago, but now rough wooden frames jutted from the snow-covered ground like the skeleton of a dream refusing to die. Her 6-year-old daughter, Emma, sat on a makeshift bench nearby, wrapped in every scrap of fabric they owned, quietly reading from a tattered book by the light of a small fire Sarah had built in a metal barrel. The child's lips moved silently as she traced each word with her finger, determined to learn despite having no teacher, no classroom, and no hope that either would ever come to their mountain town. Sarah had never imagined herself as a builder. 3 months ago, she had been the wife of a miner, living in a company house with steady meals and the security of knowing tomorrow would look much like today. But the copper mine had closed overnight when the vein played out, and with it went not just her husband's job, but her husband himself. Thomas Mitchell had loaded his few belongings onto a wagon bound for California goldfields, promising to send for them once he struck it rich. That was October. Now it was January, and the only letters Sarah received were from the bank demanding payment on debts she never knew existed. The mining company had evicted families systematically, giving them just enough time to gather their possessions before boarding up the houses. Some families had relatives in distant towns who could take them in. Others had savings to carry them through until spring brought new opportunities. Sarah had neither, just a 6-year-old daughter and a growing child in her belly that made every task twice as difficult and every breath a labor of hope. Cedar Falls had transformed from a thriving community of 800 souls to a ghost town of barely 200 in the span of 6 weeks. The families who remained were those with nowhere else to go, scraping by on charity and stubborn pride. The school had closed when Miss Clara Jones packed her belongings and accepted a teaching position in Helena, leaving 23 children with no education and no prospects for one. Sarah discovered the truth about her daughter's future on a gray December morning when she inquired at the town hall about when a new teacher might arrive. Marcus Whitfield, the self-important head of the town council, had barely looked up from his ledger when he delivered his verdict. There would be no new teacher. There were no funds for education. The remaining family should be grateful the general store was still operating and the church still held services. Children could learn what they needed from their parents. But what if their parents had never learned to read? What if their mothers had spent their childhoods working in fields instead of studying books? What if their fathers knew mining and little else, and now even that knowledge was worthless? Sarah had asked these questions and received only a dismissive wave of Whitfield's hand. Education was a luxury Cedar Falls could no longer afford. That night, as Emma struggled through a picture book that Sarah herself could barely read, the idea began to form. It started as a whisper of possibility, then grew into a persistent voice that kept her awake until dawn. If the town would not provide a school, perhaps she could build one herself. She knew nothing about construction, had no money for materials, and possessed no authority to teach. But she had something more powerful than any of those things, the absolute certainty that her daughter deserved better than illiteracy and hopelessness. The next morning, Sarah had walked through Cedar Falls, noting every abandoned building, every pile of discarded lumber, every window that had been removed before families departed. The mining company had left behind stacks of wooden support, beams that were too weathered for industrial use but might serve for walls. A burned-out house on Maple Street still had good floorboards beneath the charred exterior. The old Methodist church, damaged by a fallen tree, had been stripped of its pews, but the seats could be repurposed as desks. She began with nothing but her bare hands and a borrowed hammer from the sympathetic blacksmith. Every morning before dawn, she would bundle Emma in blankets and walk to the empty lot she had chosen for the school. The plot belonged to the mining company, but Whitfield had indicated that abandoned lots were of no concern to anyone, so long as no one expected official permission for anything built there. The work was harder than anything Sarah had ever attempted. Pulling nails from salvaged boards left her palms bloody and torn. Dragging heavy beams across snowy ground required her to stop every few feet to catch her breath and ease the strain on her growing belly. But with each plank she positioned, each nail she drove, the structure began to resemble her vision. Emma became her constant companion and helper, learning to sort nails by size and holding boards steady while her mother worked. The child never complained about the cold, never asked why they were doing something so difficult when no one else seemed to care. She simply accepted that building a school was what they did now, the way other families might tend gardens or raise chickens. Word of Sarah's project spread through the remaining population of Cedar Falls like ripples in a pond. Some reactions were supportive but cautious. Mrs. Dorothy Kane, who ran the general store, began setting aside damaged goods that Sarah might find useful, dented buckets for hauling water, torn fabric that could serve as insulation, candles that burned unevenly but still provided light. Pastor Henry Collins offered prayers for her success and occasional help carrying heavier materials, though he warned her gently about taking on too much in her condition. Other reactions were less encouraging. Marcus Whitfield made pointed comments about foolish women who didn't understand their limitations. He reminded anyone who would listen that Sarah had no teaching credentials, no authority to establish a school, and no realistic plan for funding or maintaining such an institution. When spring came and people began to rebuild their lives elsewhere, he predicted the ramshackle structure would stand empty as a monument to misguided ambition. But Sarah continued working, driven by a vision that grew clearer with each passing day. She imagined Emma and the other children sitting at proper desks, bent over books and slates, their minds expanding beyond the narrow confines of survival and hardship. She pictured herself leading lessons in reading and arithmetic, sharing the limited knowledge she possessed while learning alongside her students. Most importantly, she envisioned a future where the children of Cedar Falls had choices beyond poverty and desperation. The physical toll was undeniable. Her back ached constantly from bending and lifting. Her hands became so raw that she had to wrap them in strips of cloth to continue working. The cold penetrated every layer of clothing she owned, making her joints stiff and her movements clumsy. Some mornings she felt so exhausted that she considered resting, just for one day, but then she would look at Emma reading by firelight and force herself to continue. The structure slowly took shape through January's bitter winds and February's heavy snows. The foundation was imperfect, the walls uneven, and the roof leaked in 3 places, but it was undeniably a building. Sarah had scavenged glass for 2 windows and built a simple door from salvaged planks. Inside, she arranged seating for 12 children, optimistic that families would trust her with their most precious possessions. It was on a morning when the wind carried the promise of spring, when the snow had begun to soften and the days grew noticeably longer, that Sarah first became aware she was being watched. She had arrived at the construction site before dawn, as was her habit, and was reinforcing a wall joint when she sensed a presence nearby. Emma was still sleeping in their small shack, so Sarah knew she was alone yet the feeling of observation persisted. She turned slowly, scanning the tree line that bordered the lot, and caught a glimpse of movement among the pines. A horseman sat motionless in the shadows, too distant for her to discern details, but close enough to confirm she was not imagining things. The figure remained still for several minutes, then wheeled his horse and disappeared back into the forest. Without approaching or acknowledging her, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Cedar Falls was small enough that she knew everyone who remained, and none of them had reason to spy on her from the woods. The horseman's behavior suggested either hostility or intense curiosity, neither of which boded well for her project. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That afternoon, Mrs. Kane mentioned that she had seen a stranger in town, a well-dressed man who had asked questions about the woman building the school. He had been polite but insistent, wanting to know details about Sarah's background, her qualifications, and her plans for the building. Mrs. Kane had provided only basic information, but she warned Sarah to be cautious. Strangers asking questions usually meant trouble for people like them. The warning proved prescient. The next morning, as Sarah worked on installing a makeshift blackboard she had crafted from a large piece of slate, Marcus Whitfield arrived at the construction site, accompanied by two men she didn't recognize. One was clearly the stranger Mrs. Kane had described, tall, well-dressed in a wool coat that probably cost more than Sarah's family spent on food in 6 months. The other was older, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the expression of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. Whitfield cleared his throat importantly before speaking. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to inform you that this construction project must cease immediately." His voice carried the weight of official authority, though Sarah suspected he possessed less power than he claimed. Sarah set down her tools and faced the three men, her hands resting protectively on her belly. "On whose authority?" "The mining company has decided to reclaim this lot for future development," Whitfield announced, gesturing to the man with the satchel. "Mr. Peterson here represents their legal interests, and he has instructed me to inform you that any structures must be removed within 30 days. Peterson stepped forward, his manner formal but not unkind. "Ma'am, I understand you've put considerable effort into this project, but the property belongs to Copper Mountain Mining Corporation. We can't allow unauthorized construction to continue." The well-dressed stranger had remained silent during this exchange, but Sarah noticed his intense attention to every detail of the building. His gaze moved methodically from foundation to roof, assessing the construction with the eye of someone who understood building techniques. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a slight accent she couldn't identify. "What exactly were you planning to do with this structure?" he asked, directing the question to Sarah rather than the other men. "I'm building a school," Sarah replied. Simply, "The children here have no education since the mine closed. They deserve the chance to learn." The stranger nodded slowly, then turned to Peterson. "The mining company has no immediate plans for this property, correct?" Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no specific plans, but policy requires that valuable assets be protected from unauthorized use," the stranger interrupted. "But this lot has no commercial value and won't for years, if ever. Meanwhile, this woman is improving the property with her own labor and materials." Whitfield's face reddened. "Mr. Rodriguez, with all due respect, you don't understand the situation here. This woman has no authority to establish a school. She has no teaching credentials, no funding, no official sanction from any educational board." So the stranger was Rodriguez. Sarah had heard the name whispered in town. Daniel Rodriguez, owner of the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, a man whose wealth was rumored to exceed that of some state governors. Why he was interested in her small construction project remained a mystery. Rodriguez turned his attention back to Sarah, studying her with the same careful assessment he had given the building. "How many children do you expect to teach?" 23 are of school age, Sarah answered. "Though some families may leave before spring. And your qualifications?" Sarah lifted her chin, refusing to be ashamed of her limitations. "I can read and write. I know basic arithmetic. I understand that learning is more important than credentials when children have nothing." A small smile played at the corners of Rodriguez's mouth. An honest answer. He turned to Peterson. "I'd like to purchase this lot from the mining company." Peterson blinked in surprise. "Sir, it's just an empty lot with a half finished. Name your price." The transaction took less than 10 minutes. Rodriguez wrote a check that made Peterson's eyes widen, and suddenly Sarah found herself standing on property owned by the richest man in the territory. She wasn't sure whether this development was a blessing or a catastrophe. After Peterson and Whitfield departed, Rodriguez approached the building and ran his hand along one of the walls Sarah had constructed. "Your technique is sound," he said. "Self-taught? Trial and error," Sarah admitted, with emphasis on the error. Rodriguez chuckled. "The best way to learn. May I ask why you decided to do this?" Sarah gestured toward the town, where smoke rose from the chimneys of the few occupied houses. "Because someone has to. These children didn't choose to be born in a place that stopped believing in its future. They deserve the chance to create their own. And you believe education will give them that chance?" "I believe ignorance will definitely deny it to them." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to make you a proposition, Mrs. Mitchell. I'll provide materials and labor to complete this school properly. In exchange, I ask only that you continue what you've started." Sarah stared at him, unsure she had heard correctly. "I don't understand. Why would you do that?" "Because I've seen what happens to communities that abandon their children's education. They don't recover." Rodriguez paused, gazing out at the mountains that surrounded Cedar Falls. "And because I believe in backing people who refuse to quit when everyone else has given up." The offer was beyond anything Sarah had dared hope for, but she sensed complications lurking beneath the generous surface. "What aren't you telling me?" Rodriguez smiled more broadly. "You're perceptive. The truth is, I need this school to succeed as much as you do, but that's a longer conversation. For now, just tell me, are you willing to accept help?" Sarah looked at the building she had constructed with bleeding hands and stubborn determination, then at the man whose wealth could transform her desperate dream into something magnificent. The decision should have been easy, but she had learned to be wary of gifts that seemed too generous. "I'll accept your help," she said finally, "but I won't accept charity. This school belongs to the children and the community. If you want to invest in it, you'll be a partner, not a patron." Rodriguez extended his hand. "Mrs. Mitchell, I believe we understand each other perfectly." Daniel Rodriguez arrived at dawn 3 days later, but he came alone. Sarah had expected wagons full of workers and materials, the kind of grand gesture that wealthy men used to demonstrate their power. Instead, she found him kneeling beside her foundation, running his fingers along the mortar joints she had painstakingly crafted from creek sand and lime. "You mixed this yourself?" he asked without looking up. Sarah set down the bucket of water she had been carrying and wiped her hands on her apron. "The blacksmith told me the proportions. It took 4 tries to get it right." Rodriguez stood and brushed dust from his knees. "It's better than right. It's resourceful." He gestured toward a leather tool roll he had placed nearby. "I brought some things that might help." The tools were beautiful, their handles worn smooth by skilled hands, their metal surfaces gleaming with careful maintenance. Sarah had never seen implements of such quality, and she hesitated to touch them. "These are too fine for someone like me." "These belong to my father," Rodriguez said quietly. "He built our first ranch house with them, and the barn, and the barn, and the bought our first ranch house with them, and the boss bunkhouse." He always said tools were meant to be used, not admired. Sarah lifted a plane from the roll, feeling its perfect balance in her hands. What happened to him? Pneumonia, 5 winters ago. He never got to see the ranch become what it is now. Rodriguez picked up a chisel and examined the blade. He would have liked this project. He believed that building something useful was the highest form of prayer. They worked together that morning in comfortable silence, Sarah learning techniques she had never imagined while Rodriguez adapted his methods to accommodate her growing belly and inexperience. He showed her how to measure twice and cut once, how to test the square of a corner, how to sense when a joint was tight enough without being forced. "You have good instincts," he observed, as Sarah successfully notched a beam on her 3rd attempt. "Most people try to muscle their way through problems. You think first." "I can't afford to waste materials," Sarah replied. "Every board counts when you're scavenging. Even when materials are plentiful, waste is still waste." Rodriguez paused in his work. "May I ask you something personal?" Sarah nodded, though she tensed slightly. "Where is your husband?" The question she had been dreading since Rodriguez first appeared. "California. Chasing gold that probably doesn't exist." "He left you to do this alone?" "He left before I started this. Thomas isn't a bad man, but he's not a strong one either." When the mind closed, he couldn't see past the failure to any possibility of rebuilding. Rodriguez absorbed this information without judgment. "And you could?" Sarah gestured toward the school, taking shape around them. "I had to. Emma's counting on me." That afternoon, Emma arrived home from her daily wandering to find Rodriguez teaching her mother how to hang a door properly. The child stopped short when she saw the stranger, her face closing into the careful blankness that children develop when they've learned not to trust easily. "Emma, this is Mr. Rodriguez," Sarah said. "He's helping us with the school." Emma studied Rodriguez with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "Why?" The directness of the question made Sarah wince, but Rodriguez smiled. "Because your mother is doing something important, and important things shouldn't have to be done alone." "Are you rich?" Emma asked. "Emma!" Sarah exclaimed, mortified, but Rodriguez laughed. "Yes, I am. Does that worry you?" Emma considered this seriously. "Rich people usually don't help poor people unless they want something back." "You're absolutely right to be suspicious," Rodriguez agreed. "What do you think I might want?" "I don't know yet," Emma said. "But I'm watching." Rodriguez knelt to Emma's eye level. "I hope you'll keep watching. And I hope that when you decide whether to trust me, you'll judge me by what I do, not what I have." Emma nodded solemnly and went inside to help her mother prepare dinner. Rodriguez remained outside, finishing the door installation by lamplight. Over the following weeks, Rodriguez appeared each morning as the sun crested the mountains, working steadily until the light failed. He brought no crew, no wagon loads of expensive materials. Instead, he taught Sarah to see potential where she had seen only limitations. A pile of discarded mining equipment became brackets for shelving. Broken furniture yielded hardware and joinery techniques. Even the smallest scraps of wood found purpose in his hands. "You could hire men to do this faster," Sarah observed one afternoon as they struggled to position a heavy roof beam. "Faster isn't always better," Rodriguez replied. "Besides, this isn't my school to build. It's yours to learn how to build." The distinction puzzled Sarah until she began to understand that Rodriguez was teaching her skills that would last long after the school was completed. Every technique he demonstrated, every problem-solving method he employed, became part of Sarah's growing expertise. She was not merely accepting his help. She was absorbing his knowledge. The transformation was evident in more than just her construction abilities. Sarah found herself thinking differently about problems, approaching challenges with a methodical confidence she had never possessed. When the roof leaked during a February storm, she didn't panic or despair. Instead, She analyzed the problem, identified the source, and developed a solution using materials at hand. "You're becoming a builder," Rodriguez observed, watching her work. "I'm becoming someone I didn't know I could be," Sarah replied. Their partnership developed its own rhythm and rituals. Rodriguez arrived each morning carrying 2 cups of coffee, claiming he had made too much at the ranch but clearly bringing it for Sarah's benefit. They would spend the first hour of each day planning the work ahead, discussing techniques and materials while the coffee warmed them against the mountain cold. Emma gradually accepted Rodriguez's presence, though she maintained her careful observation of his motives. She began to help with simple tasks, learning to sort nails and hold tools steady. Rodriguez treated her contributions seriously, never dismissing her efforts as mere child's play. "She's intelligent," he told Sarah one evening as they cleaned. "Tools by lantern light. Have you considered what kind of education she might pursue beyond what this school can provide?" Sarah's hands stilled. "I think about it constantly. But wanting something and being able to provide it are different things. What if they didn't have to be?" Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Emma emerged from the school building carrying the slate board she had been practicing writing on. She held it up proudly, displaying a carefully lettered sentence. "I wrote about the school," she announced. Sarah read the words aloud. "This school will teach children to dream bigger than their circumstances." Rodriguez smiled. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Emma pointed at her mother. "From watching her build something everyone said was impossible." That night, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed in their small shack, the child asked a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Mama, what happens when the school is finished?" "What do you mean? Will Mr. Rodriguez still come around? Or will he go back to his ranch and forget about us?" Sarah smoothed Emma's hair, wishing she had a confident answer. "I don't know, sweetheart. But even if he does, we'll still have what we've built together. The school? The school and the knowledge of how to build it. No one can take that away from us." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I hope he stays. I like learning from him." "What has he taught you?" "That rich people can be nice if they choose to be. And that choosing to be nice is more important than being rich." Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead, marveling at the wisdom that emerged from such a young mind. "Those are good lessons." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah arrived at the construction site to find Marcus Whitfield examining the building with obvious displeasure. Rodriguez stood nearby, his posture casual but alert. "Mrs. Mitchell," Whitfield began formally, "I've received complaints about this project." "What kind of complaints?" Sarah asked. "Concerns about safety, about qualifications, about the precedent being set by allowing unauthorized educational institutions." Rodriguez stepped forward. "The building is being constructed on private property with the owner's full permission. What authority do you have to regulate it?" Whitfield's face reddened. "The authority of common sense and community standards. This woman is not qualified to teach children, and this structure is not fit to house a school." "On what grounds do you make that assessment?" Rodriguez asked calmly. "Look at it." Whitfield gestured dismissively. "It's a ramshackle assemblage of salvaged materials. There are no proper desks, no adequate heating, no sanitary facilities. All of which can be addressed," Rodriguez replied. "What can't be addressed is the absence of any alternative." "The alternative is accepting reality," Whitfield snapped. "Cedar Falls is a dying town. Pretending otherwise by building fantasy schools won't change that fact." Sarah felt anger building in her chest, but before she could respond, Rodriguez spoke again. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm curious about something." "What exactly are you afraid of?" The question caught Whitfield off guard. "I'm not afraid of anything. I'm being practical. Are you afraid that the school might succeed? That children might actually learn something useful here? Or are you afraid that their success might highlight your own failure to provide leadership when the community needed it most?" Whitfield sputtered indignantly. How dare you suggest? I'm not suggesting anything, Rodriguez said quietly. I'm asking what you're afraid of, because fear is the only reason I can think of for opposing something that costs you nothing and might benefit everyone. This project is doomed to failure, Whitfield declared. When it collapses, as it inevitably will, the children will be disappointed and the community will be divided. Mrs. Mitchell's good intentions don't change the fundamental impossibility of her situation. Sarah had heard enough. Mr. Whitfield, 3 months ago you told me that education was a luxury Cedar Falls couldn't afford. But the children are still here, and they're still growing, and every day they don't learn is a day they can't get back. I may not be qualified by your standards, but I'm here, and I'm trying, and that's more than anyone else was willing to do. Whitfield opened his mouth to respond, but Rodriguez raised a hand to stop him. The conversation is over, Rodriguez said with quiet authority. Mrs. Mitchell is building a school on private property with private resources. If you have legal objections, file them with the territorial court. If you have educational concerns, offer constructive suggestions. If you're simply here to discourage something that doesn't affect you directly, then you're wasting everyone's time. Whitfield glared at both of them, then turned on his heel and stalked away. Sarah watched him go, feeling both vindicated and worried. Have I made an enemy? She asked. You already had one, Rodriguez replied. Now you know what he looks like. That afternoon brought the first real test of the school's construction. A spring storm rolled down from the peaks with unusual ferocity, bringing heavy rain and gusting. Winds that strained every joint and tested every board. Sarah and Rodriguez huddled inside the building, listening to the structure groan and shift around them. Will it hold? Sarah asked, watching water drip steadily through several spots. In the roof. It's holding, Rodriguez said confidently. The foundation is solid, and the frame is properly braced. A few leaks don't mean failure. Emma sat on one of the benches they had built, seemingly unconcerned by the storm raging outside. She had brought her slate and was practicing letters. By the light of a lantern, her concentration absolute. She has remarkable focus, Rodriguez observed. She's learned to find peace wherever she can, Sarah replied. When your whole world can change overnight, you hold tight to whatever stays. Constant. Rodriguez watched Emma work for several minutes before speaking again. I want to tell you something about why I'm really here. Sarah tensed, sensing that the conversation she had been both anticipating and dreading was about to begin. I own more land than any one person should, Rodriguez continued. More cattle than I can count, more money than I can spend in several lifetimes. But none of that means anything if the communities around me wither and die. I don't understand. A ranch needs neighbors. It needs towns with businesses and schools and churches. It needs families who stay and build and invest in the future. When places like Cedar Falls disappear, they take something irreplaceable with them. Sarah began to see the larger picture. You're not just helping me build a school, you're trying to save the town. I'm trying to give it a reason to save itself. Education attracts families. Families create businesses. Businesses generate prosperity. The cycle has to start somewhere. And you think one small school can start that cycle? Rodriguez smiled. I think one determined woman building a school with her bare hands can inspire people to believe that impossible things are actually possible. And belief is where all progress begins. The storm passed near midnight, leaving the air clean and sharp with the scent of wet pine. Sarah walked through the building by lamplight, assessing damage and making mental notes about repairs needed. The roof leaked in several new places, and one wall had shifted slightly where the wind had found a weakness in the bracing. But the school still stood. It survived its first real test, Rodriguez said, joining her inspection. Barely, Sarah replied, noting the various problems. The best buildings are the ones that survive their early failures and emerge stronger. We'll fix what's wrong and reinforce what's weak. And if the next storm is worse, then we'll learn from that one too. Sarah looked around at the space that was slowly becoming what she had envisioned. The walls were plumb, the floors level, the windows positioned to catch the morning light. It was far from perfect, but it was undeniably a school. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For believing this was possible when I wasn't sure I believed it myself." Rodriguez picked up a piece of debris blown in by the storm and tossed it outside. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've watched you work for weeks now. You never doubted this was possible. You just doubted whether you could make it happen. What's the difference?" "The difference is everything. Believing in the goal is easy. Believing in yourself is where courage lives." As they prepared to leave for the night, Emma gathered her school materials and carefully arranged them in the corner where she always left them. Her possessions were few: a slate, some chalk, 2 pencils, and a collection of books in various stages of disrepair, but she treated them with the reverence of a scholar. "Tomorrow I'm going to start reading to the other children," she announced. Sarah looked at her daughter in surprise. "What other children?" "The ones who've been watching us work. They come to the edge of the trees sometimes and look at the school, but they're too shy to come closer. I think they want to learn but don't know if they're allowed." Rodriguez knelt beside Emma. "That's very observant. What made you think of reading to them?" "Because reading out loud makes stories belong to everyone, not just the person holding the book." Sarah felt her throat tighten with pride and something deeper, recognition that her daughter was already becoming the kind of person who thought beyond herself. "That's a wonderful idea," Sarah managed. Emma nodded seriously. "I'll start with the easy books and work up to harder ones. By the time the school is finished, maybe they'll be ready to come inside." As they walked back to their shack through the storm-washed night, Sarah realized that the most important transformation wasn't happening to the building. It was happening to the people connected to it. Emma was discovering leadership, Rodriguez was rediscovering purpose, and Sarah herself was becoming someone she had never imagined she could be. The school was more than logs and nails and salvaged materials. It was becoming a place where impossible things proved to be simply things that hadn't been attempted yet. And tomorrow they would continue building it together. Emma's prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. The next afternoon, as Sarah applied fresh mortar to a section of wall damaged by the storm, she noticed movement at the forest's edge. 3 children stood half-hidden behind a massive pine, their faces barely visible, but their curiosity unmistakable. Emma sat on a stump outside the school building, reading aloud from a story about a brave mouse who saved a kingdom. The mouse knew he was small, Emma's clear voice carried across the clearing, but he also knew that being small meant he could fit through spaces that bigger creatures couldn't reach. Sarah continued her work while keeping one eye on the hidden audience. The children crept closer with each page Emma turned, drawn by the magic of story despite their obvious shyness. By the time Emma reached the tale's climax, they had emerged fully from the trees, sitting cross-legged in the dirt 20 feet away. Rodriguez arrived just as Emma finished the story. He assessed the situation quickly and quietly, setting down his tools without making any sound that might startle the young listeners. "That was a good story," called out the oldest of the 3 children, a boy who looked to be about 10. "Do you have more books?" Emma smiled and held up a small stack. "Lots more. Would you like to hear another one?" The children exchanged glances, then nodded eagerly. Emma opened a different book and began reading about a girl who built wings from feathers and dreams. As her voice wove the story through the mountain air, more children appeared from various directions. They came singly and in pairs, materializing from the forest and the town's scattered houses like flowers opening to sunlight. "Word travels fast in a small place," Rodriguez murmured to Sarah. "Good word or bad word?" Sarah asked, watching the growing audience. "With children, it's usually honest word," By the end of the second story, 8 children sat in a loose semicircle around Emma. They ranged in age from perhaps 5 to 12, dressed in the patched and mended clothing that marked families struggling to survive. Some Sarah recognized as the children of miners who had stayed behind. Others were strangers, possibly the offspring of homesteaders or drifters who had found refuge in the area's abandoned buildings. When Emma closed the book, a girl with tangled red hair raised her hand tentatively. "Yes?" Emma asked, as formal as any teacher. "Can you teach us to read like that?" Emma looked toward her mother, suddenly uncertain. Sarah wiped mortar from her hands and walked over to the group. "Would you like to learn?" Sarah asked gently. The children nodded with varying degrees of enthusiasm and worry. The red-haired girl spoke again. "We don't have money for school. The school won't cost money," Sarah replied. "It will cost attention and effort and practice. Can you afford those things?" The children looked at each other, then back at Sarah. The oldest boy stood up. "My pa says book learning is for folks who don't have to work for a living. What do you think?" Sarah asked. The boy considered this seriously. "I think knowing how to read might help me work smarter instead of just harder." "That's good thinking. What's your name?" "Tommy Brennan." "This is my sister Lucy and my little brother Pete." "I'm Sarah Mitchell, and this is Emma. The gentleman over there is Mr. Rodriguez." Rodriguez stepped forward and tipped his hat. "Pleased to meet you all." Tommy studied Rodriguez with the same careful assessment Emma had employed weeks earlier. "You're the rich rancher." "I am. Why are you helping build a school for poor kids?" Rodriguez knelt to Tommy's eye level. "Because smart kids grow up to be smart adults, and smart adults make everyone's life better. Rich or poor doesn't matter much if you're smart enough to solve problems." Lucy tugged on Tommy's sleeve. "Ask him about the stories." "What stories?" Tommy asked. Rodriguez smiled. "Lucy's wondering if I know any stories worth telling." Lucy nodded shyly. "I know a few," Rodriguez said. "Would you like to hear one while your mother and Mrs. Mitchell work on the school?" The children settled expectantly in the dirt. Rodriguez sat on a nearby stump and began a tale about a young vaquero who tamed wild horses with patience instead of force. His voice was different when he told stories, warmer and more musical, with a slight accent that made ordinary words sound like music. Sarah found herself listening as intently as the children while she continued laying mortar. Rodriguez had a gift for weaving details that made imaginary places feel real and impossible events seem perfectly logical. When he described the vaquero's first encounter with a magnificent stallion that had never known rope or saddle, even Sarah could picture the scene with startling clarity. "The horse was beautiful," Rodriguez continued, "but he was also angry and afraid. He had been hurt by men before, and he didn't understand that not all men were the same." Emma raised her hand. "How did the vaquero make the horse trust him?" "He started by sitting very still at the edge of the horse's territory, doing nothing threatening, just being present. Every day, he moved a little closer, but only when the horse seemed comfortable. He never tried to force anything." "How long did it take?" asked Pete, the youngest Brennan child. 3 months of patience," Rodriguez replied. "But in the end, the horse chose to trust him, and that made all the difference. Trust that's freely given is much stronger than obedience that's forced." Sarah realized the story was about more than horses. She glanced at the children's faces and saw that some of them understood the deeper meaning as well. When Rodriguez finished his tale, Tommy stood up again. "Mr. Rodriguez, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you trying to tame us like the vaquero tamed the horse?" Rodriguez considered the question seriously. "No, Tommy, I'm not trying to tame anyone. I'm hoping to earn your trust so we can work together to build something good. What if we don't want to be worked with? Then you're free to walk away anytime you choose. No one will force you to come here or learn anything you don't want to learn." Tommy nodded slowly. "That's fair, I guess." I hope so. Fair is all I'm aiming for. The children dispersed gradually as the afternoon wore on, but they all promised to return the next day. Emma walked them partway to town, chattering excitedly about the books they would read and the things they might learn together. You handled that well, Rodriguez told Sarah as they watched the small procession disappear among the trees. I'm terrified, Sarah admitted. What if I can't teach them properly? What if I disappoint them? What if you succeed beyond your wildest expectations? That's even more frightening. Rodriguez picked up a piece of lumber and began measuring it for the next day's work. Fear means you care about the outcome. That's the first requirement for being a good teacher. What are the other requirements? Patience, creativity, and the willingness to learn alongside your students. Sarah watched Emma return from her escort duties, practically bouncing with excitement. She's already a better teacher than I am. She's learned from watching you that teaching is about sharing what you know, not proving how much you know. That's a lesson many educated teachers never learn. The next morning brought an unexpected challenge. Sarah arrived at the school to find a formal notice nailed to the door. The document, signed by Marcus Whitfield and 2 other town council members, declared the building unsafe for occupation and ordered all activities to cease until a proper inspection could be conducted. Rodriguez read the notice carefully, his expression darkening. This is harassment disguised as bureaucracy. Can they do this? Sarah asked. They can try. Whether they can make it stick is another question. Emma appeared at Sarah's elbow, studying the notice with a frown. What does unsafe for occupation mean? It means Mr. Whitfield thinks our school isn't strong enough to keep people safe inside it, Sarah explained. Emma walked around the building, examining the walls and testing the door. It seems plenty strong to me. I've been inside it during storms. Mr. Whitfield has different standards, Rodriguez said diplomatically. Or different motives, Sarah added, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. At precisely 9 o'clock, the children began arriving for what had spontaneously become the school's first official day. They found Sarah, Emma, and Rodriguez standing outside the locked building, the notice fluttering in the morning breeze like a surrender flag. Why can't we go inside? Tommy asked. Sarah explained the situation as simply as possible. The children listened with the grave attention of people who had already learned that adult decisions could disrupt their lives without warning or explanation. So we can't have school? Lucy asked, her disappointment evident. We can't have school inside the building, Sarah corrected. But school isn't really about the building, is it? Emma's face brightened. We can have school outside. In the dirt? Pete asked doubtfully. Why not? Rodriguez said. Some of the best learning happens under open sky. Within minutes, the children had arranged themselves in a circle on the ground outside the school. Sarah fetched the books and slate boards from inside, and Emma began the day's first lesson by reading a story about pioneers who crossed vast plains to find new homes. The pioneers had to be brave, Emma explained after finishing the story, because they didn't know what they would find at the end of their journey. Like us, said a quiet girl named Mary, who had appeared for the first time that morning. We don't know what we'll learn, but we're brave enough to try. Sarah felt her throat tighten. That's exactly right, Mary. The outdoor classroom worked better than Sarah had dared hope. Without walls to contain them, the children seemed more relaxed and engaged. They could look up at the mountains while practicing arithmetic, watch birds while learning letters, and feel the sun on their faces while listening to stories. Rodriguez contributed a lesson on practical mathematics, using fence posts and paddock measurements to teach geometry concepts. The children grasped abstract principles more easily when they could see them applied to real-world problems. If I want to build a rectangular corral that's twice as long as it is wide, Rodriguez asked, and I have 100 feet of fencing, how big can I make it? Tommy worked through the problem aloud, drawing diagrams in the dirt with a stick. It would be 20 feet wide and 40 feet long, because 20 plus 20 plus 40 plus 40 equals 100. Excellent reasoning, Rodriguez praised. Now, what if I wanted the corral to be square instead? Lucy raised her hand. 25 feet on each side, because 4 times 25 is 100. Perfect. You're both thinking like engineers. The morning passed quickly, filled with reading, arithmetic, and impromptu lessons sparked by the children's curiosity. About everything from cloud formations to the history of their mountain valley. Sarah discovered that teaching was less about having all the answers and more about helping students ask better questions. At midday, Marcus Whitfield arrived with 2 other men, expecting to find the school closed and the children dispersed. Instead, he discovered a thriving outdoor classroom where Emma was leading a spirited discussion about the difference between wants and needs. This is still an unauthorized educational institution, Whitfield announced loudly enough to interrupt the lesson. Sarah stood up calmly. This is a group of children sitting on public land, engaged in informal learning activities. What law prohibits that? The building remains closed for safety reasons, Whitfield said, gesturing toward the school. We're not using the building, Rodriguez pointed out. Problem solved. Whitfield's face reddened. You're deliberately circumventing the intent of the closure order. We're adapting to circumstances beyond our control, Sarah replied. Isn't that what you've been telling everyone they should do since the mine closed? The children watched this exchange with fascination, sensing that something important was happening, even if they didn't understand all the implications. Tommy stood up and faced Whitfield directly. Sir, are you saying we're not allowed to learn? I'm saying this woman is not qualified to teach you. She's teaching us to read and figure numbers, Lucy said. What other qualifications does she need? Proper certification from territorial education authorities, Whitfield replied stiffly. Emma joined the conversation with the fearless honesty that only children possess. Mr. Whitfield, do you know how to read? Of course I can read. Who taught you? My mother, initially, and later a proper school teacher. So your mother wasn't qualified to teach you reading, but she did it anyway. Whitfield opened and closed his mouth like a fish gasping for air. That's what Mrs. Mitchell is doing, Emma continued. She's being like your mother. Rodriguez covered his mouth to hide a smile. Sarah fought to keep her expression neutral while bursting with pride at her daughter's logic. One of the men accompanying Whitfield stepped forward. Perhaps we should reconsider the closure order. These children are clearly benefiting from the instruction. Whitfield spun toward his companion. Mr. Davies, we discussed this matter thoroughly. The building is unsafe. The building isn't being used, Davies replied. And I see no safety concerns with outdoor education. The third man nodded agreement. My own children learned their letters from their grandmother before they ever saw the inside of a formal classroom. This seems similar. Whitfield realized he was losing support from his own allies. This sets a dangerous precedent. Anyone could claim to be running a school. Anyone could claim to be running anything, Rodriguez said mildly. The difference is whether they actually accomplish it. These children are learning. That's the only precedent that matters. Whitfield glared at the assembled group, then turned on his heel and stalked away. His companions lingered for a few minutes, watching the children return to their lessons with obvious approval. Mrs. Mitchell, Davy said quietly, I want you to know that not everyone agrees with Marcus about this situation. If you need support, there are people willing to provide it. After the officials departed, the children buzzed with excitement about their role in defending the school. Did we really help? Mary asked. You were magnificent, Sarah assured her. You showed them that learning is something you want to do, not something being forced on you. Will they try to stop us again? Pete worried. Rodriguez knelt beside the youngest boy. They might try, but they can't stop people from wanting to learn. And as long as you want to learn, we'll find ways to teach you. That afternoon, something remarkable happened. Parents began arriving to observe the outdoor classroom. They came quietly, standing at respectful distances, but their presence was unmistakable. Some were curious, others skeptical, but all were paying attention. Sarah felt the weight of their scrutiny as she guided the children through a lesson. On local history, using stories Rodriguez shared about the early days of settlement in their valley. She made mistakes, stumbled over unfamiliar terms, and occasionally had to admit she didn't know the answer to a student's question. But the children remained engaged, asking follow-up questions and making connections between past and present that impressed even their hidden audience. At the end of the day, as the children gathered their belongings and prepared to head home, several parents approached Sarah directly. "Mrs. Mitchell," said a weather-beaten woman whose twin boys had attended that day, "I wanted to thank you. My sons have been reading to me every evening since they started coming here. They're so excited about learning. I can read words I never could before," added one of the twins. "Mrs. Mitchell helps us sound them out." Another parent, a man whose calloused hands marked him as a laborer, stepped forward hesitantly. "Ma'am, I never learned to read properly." "Myself. Would it be possible for you to teach adults as well as children? Maybe in the evenings?" Sarah's heart raced. The request opened possibilities she hadn't considered. Yes, I think that could be arranged. Would others be interested?" "More than you might expect," the man replied. "There's a lot of folks around here who missed out on schooling when they were young." As the crowd dispersed, Rodriguez helped Sarah collect the day's materials. "You realize what just happened?" he asked. "I think so, but I'm almost afraid to believe it. You've just created the beginning of a real educational community. Not just a school for children, but a center for learning that serves everyone. Who needs it?" Sarah looked at the building that stood empty due to bureaucratic obstruction, then at the clearing where genuine education had flourished despite official opposition. The building was never really the point, was it? She mused. "The building is important," Rodriguez said. "But you're right that it was never the point. The point is what you discovered today, that education happens wherever people gather with the intention to learn and grow together." Emma skipped over to join them, her face glowing with satisfaction. "Mama, teaching is fun. Can we do it again?" "Tomorrow? Every day," Sarah promised. "Rain or shine, inside or outside, we'll keep teaching anyone who wants to learn." That evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, the child asked a question that revealed how much she had absorbed from the day's events. "Mama, why was Mr. Whitfield so angry about us learning?" Sarah considered how to explain adult motivations to a 6-year-old mind. "Sometimes people resist change, even when the change is good. Mr. Whitfield is used to being in charge of important decisions, and our school represents a decision he didn't make. But the learning isn't hurting anyone. No, it isn't. But some people fear that if others become educated and confident, they might start making decisions for themselves instead of accepting what they're told." Emma thought about this seriously. "That sounds like those people don't trust others to make good decisions." "That's very insightful, sweetheart. Well, if they don't trust us to make good decisions, maybe we shouldn't trust them to make decisions for us either." Sarah smiled at her daughter's emerging wisdom. "Maybe you're right." Outside their small shack, the mountain night wrapped around Cedar Falls like a protective blanket. Somewhere in the darkness, Rodriguez was probably planning improvements to their outdoor classroom. Somewhere else, children were practicing the letters they had learned that day. And in houses throughout the valley, parents were reconsidering the possibilities that education might offer their families. The school building remained officially closed, but the school itself had never been more alive. 3 weeks into their outdoor education experiment, the first snow of spring arrived without warning. Sarah woke to find the world transformed into a crystalline wonderland that was beautiful but entirely impractical for ground-level learning. The children appeared as usual, bundled in every scrap of warm clothing their families could provide. But even their determination couldn't overcome the reality of sitting in 6 inches of fresh powder. "We need the building," Emma announced, stating the obvious with characteristic directness. Sarah stared at the school that remained officially condemned, its windows dark and door sealed with the authority of bureaucratic disapproval. 3 weeks of successful outdoor teaching had proven the educational concept sound, but weather was about to force a confrontation she had been hoping to avoid. Rodriguez arrived carrying an armload of split firewood and wearing an expression of quiet determination. "Time to challenge the closure order directly. How do we do that without getting arrested?" Sarah asked. "We don't break the law," Rodriguez replied. "We follow it exactly. The closure order requires an official inspection to determine safety. We demand that inspection. And if they refuse, then we have grounds to appeal their decision to territorial authorities. Meanwhile, these children need somewhere warm to learn." Tommy Brennan, who had become the unofficial leader among the students, raised his hand with formal politeness. "Mr. Rodriguez, what if we just went inside anyway? It's our school, isn't it?" "It's complicated, Tommy. The building sits on private land, but the closure order has legal weight until it's officially lifted." "That seems stupid," Lucy declared with 6-year-old bluntness. "Laws often seem stupid when they prevent people from doing obviously right things," Rodriguez agreed. "But breaking stupid laws usually creates bigger problems than following them while working to change them." Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "I'm going inside to start a fire in the stove. If anyone wants to arrest a pregnant woman for trying to keep children warm while they learn to read, they're welcome to try." Emma clapped her hands in delight. "Can we really go back inside, Mama?" "The building is sound," Sarah said, pulling the official closure notice from the door. "I know because I built most of it myself. If that's not qualification enough to judge its safety, then the system is more broken than I thought." Rodriguez watched her unlock the door with obvious admiration. "You realize this is open defiance of a government order?" "I realize these children have been sitting in dirt and snow for 3 weeks because some man decided their education was less important than his authority." The children cheered as Sarah pushed open the door and gestured them inside. The building felt almost cavernous after weeks in the open air, but it was wonderfully warm and dry. Rodriguez quickly had a fire crackling in the wood stove while Sarah arranged desks and chairs in their proper configuration. "It feels like coming home," Mary whispered, running her hand along the wall nearest her seat. "Because it is home," Emma replied. "At least for the part of us that loves learning." The morning proceeded with remarkable normalcy. Sarah guided the children through arithmetic lessons, while Rodriguez contributed practical applications from ranch management. Emma led reading groups with the confidence of someone born to teach. The unofficial adult students who had begun attending evening sessions arrived early to observe the day classes, several staying to help with instruction. By midday, word had spread through Cedar Falls that the school had reopened in defiance of the closure order. A steady stream of curious observers gathered outside the building, some supportive, others clearly disapproving. Sarah could see them through the windows but refused to let their presence affect the learning happening inside. At precisely 2 o'clock, Marcus Whitfield arrived with the territorial sheriff and 2 deputies. Their heavy footsteps on the wooden porch caused the children to look up from their lessons with expressions of concern. Sarah stood and walked to the door before anyone could knock. She opened it calmly and stepped outside, closing it behind her to shield the children from whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Mrs. Mitchell," the sheriff said formally, "you're in violation of a lawful closure order. I'm here to ensure compliance." "Sheriff Watson, I'm providing education to children who have no other opportunity to learn. If that's a crime, then something is fundamentally wrong with our laws." Rodriguez appeared beside her, having slipped out through a side door. "Sheriff, Before you take any action, I'd like you to see something." Without waiting for permission, Rodriguez gestured toward the window that looked into the main classroom. Inside, Tommy was helping younger children sound out difficult words, while Emma demonstrated fraction concepts using pieces of pie she had drawn on the slate board. The scene radiated warmth, purpose, and genuine learning. "Those children have been attending classes here for almost a month," Rodriguez continued. "They're reading better, calculating more accurately, and thinking more clearly than when they started. What exactly are we protecting them from?" Sheriff Watson studied the scene through the window for a long moment. The building was declared unsafe. By whom? Sarah asked. What qualifications did the person making that declaration possess? What specific safety hazards were identified? Whitfield stepped forward impatiently. The qualifications of the inspector are irrelevant. The order exists and must be enforced. Actually, Mr. Whitfield, the qualifications are entirely relevant, said a new voice from behind the group. Everyone turned to see a well-dressed stranger approaching on horseback, followed by a wagon carrying several other men. Rodriguez smiled. Perfect timing, Commissioner. The newcomer dismounted and removed his hat. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Commissioner James Harrison, Territorial Supervisor of Education. I've come to conduct the official inspection that should have been performed weeks ago. Whitfield's face went pale. Commissioner, I wasn't expecting that is. We weren't notified because you filed a closure order without requesting proper inspection procedures. Harrison interrupted. That's a serious breach of protocol, Mr. Whitfield. Harrison approached the building with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had inspected hundreds of structures. He examined the foundation, tested the wall joints, checked the roof, supports, and assessed the heating and ventilation systems. His companions, whom he identified as a territorial building inspector and a certified educator, conducted their own evaluations. The children watched through the windows as the officials crawled under the building, climbed onto the roof, and measured various structural elements. Emma pressed her nose against the glass, fascinated by the process. After nearly an hour, Harrison returned to the group waiting on the porch. This building meets or exceeds all territorial standards for educational facilities. In fact, it's better constructed than most schools I've seen, particularly considering the limited resources available. That's impossible, Whitfield sputtered. It was built by an unqualified woman using salvaged materials. Mr. Whitfield, Harrison said coldly, I've been inspecting buildings for 15 years. This structure is sound, well-designed, and entirely safe for its intended purpose. Your closure order was issued without proper investigation and will be immediately rescinded. Sheriff Watson removed his hat and scratched his head. So there's no violation to enforce? The only violation here is the improper use of bureaucratic authority to prevent children from receiving education. Harrison replied, Mrs. Mitchell, you have my official authorization to operate this school. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. Thank you, Commissioner. Don't thank me yet. I have some questions about your teaching qualifications and educational program. Sarah's heart sank. After everything they had accomplished, would she be shut down on different grounds? Harrison continued, I've been observing your classes through the window, and I'm impressed by what I see. Your methods are unconventional but effective. However, territorial law requires all teachers to meet certain minimum standards. What kind of standards? Sarah asked. Demonstrated competency in reading, writing, and arithmetic, plus basic knowledge of history and geography. Usually verified through formal testing. Rodriguez stepped forward. Commissioner, would you be willing to conduct that testing today? That's highly irregular, but given the circumstances, I suppose it's appropriate. Sarah's mind raced. She could read and write adequately, handle basic mathematics, and had absorbed considerable historical knowledge from Rodriguez's stories. But formal testing was intimidating after years of doubting her own intelligence. "I'll take the test," she said quietly. "Excellent. We'll need a quiet space for the examination." Emma appeared at Sarah's elbow. "Mama, can I watch?" Harrison smiled. "Actually, young lady, I have some questions for you as well. I understand you've been helping with instruction?" Emma nodded seriously. "I read to the little children and help them with letters." "And how do you feel about learning in this school?" "It's the best place in the world," Emma replied without hesitation. "Everyone here wants to learn, and Mrs. Mitchell makes everything make sense." Harrison's formal expression softened. "That's the best recommendation any teacher could receive." The testing took place in the schoolroom while the children worked quietly on independent assignments. Harrison's questions covered reading, comprehension, mathematical problem-solving, historical knowledge, and educational philosophy. Sarah found herself drawing on months of experience teaching real children facing real challenges. "Mrs. Mitchell," Harrison said during the section on educational methods, "what do you consider the most important aspect of teaching?" Sarah thought of Tommy's breakthrough with fractions, Lucy's excitement about reading new books, and Emma's natural instinct for helping younger children understand difficult concepts. "Making each child feel capable of learning," she answered. "Too many of these children have been told they're not smart enough for education. My job is to prove them wrong by finding the way each child learns best." Harrison nodded approvingly. "And how do you handle students with different skill levels in the same classroom?" "I use the advanced students to help teach the beginners. It reinforces their own learning while building confidence in the struggling students. Everyone becomes both teacher and student." Interesting approach. Very progressive. After 2 hours of testing, Harrison announced his decision to the assembled crowd that had gathered outside the school. "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell has demonstrated competency in all required subjects and shows exceptional understanding of practical educational methods. She is hereby certified as a territorial teacher, authorized to operate this school under official sanction." The children erupted in cheers. Parents who had been watching nervously smiled with relief. Even some of Whitfield's supporters applauded. But Harrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore, based on my observations and conversations with students and parents, I'm recommending this school as a model for rural education throughout the territory. Mrs. Mitchell's methods should be studied and replicated elsewhere." Rodriguez stepped forward. "Commissioner, if you're serious about replication, I'd like to discuss funding for additional schools in this region." "Mr. Rodriguez, I'd be very interested in that conversation." As the officials departed and the crowd dispersed, Sarah found herself alone with Emma and Rodriguez in the suddenly quiet classroom. The day's events felt surreal, like waking from a dream that had somehow become reality. "I can't believe it's over," Sarah said. "It's not over," Rodriguez replied. "It's beginning. You've just been handed official authority to do what you've already been doing brilliantly." Emma climbed onto her mother's lap, careful of the growing baby. "Mama, does this mean we can keep teaching forever?" "As long as there are children who want to learn, we'll keep teaching," Sarah promised. That evening, the first official celebration in Cedar Falls since the mine closure brought the entire remaining community together in the school building. Parents brought food, children performed readings and recitations, and Rodriguez shared stories that had everyone laughing. Mrs. Kane from the general store presented Sarah with a gift, a proper teacher's bell, that had belonged to her own grandmother. "Every real school needs a school bell," she explained. Pastor Collins offered a blessing for the school and its mission. "May this place always be a beacon of hope for those who seek knowledge and wisdom." Even some of Whitfield's former supporters approached Sarah with congratulations and offers of assistance. The transformation in community attitude was remarkable, as if official recognition had given people permission to support something they had secretly admired all along. Late in the evening, as the celebration wound down and families headed home, Sarah stood in the doorway of her school and marveled at how much had changed since that first morning, when she had driven a stake into frozen ground with nothing but a rock and determination. Rodriguez joined her, carrying sleeping Emma in his arms. "What are you thinking about?" "About how impossible this seemed when I started. About how many times I thought about quitting." "What kept you going?" Sarah looked at the child sleeping peacefully in Rodriguez's arms, then at the building that had become so much more than walls and roof. The certainty that giving up would guarantee failure, while continuing gave failure a chance to become success. Rodriguez nodded. "That's the difference between hope and despair, the willingness to keep working when success seems impossible." As they walked through the mountain night toward their humble homes, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate widow to certified teacher, from homeless refugee to community leader. The transformation had been gradual, built through daily choices to continue when stopping would have been easier. Behind them, the school stood solid and welcoming in the darkness, its windows glowing softly with banked coals from the fire that would warm tomorrow's lessons. Inside, books waited on shelves, slates lay ready for young hands, and desks stood in neat rows like promises of education yet to be delivered. But the building, impressive as it was, remained secondary to the larger truth Sarah had discovered through months of struggle and triumph. Education wasn't really about buildings or certifications or official recognition. It was about the moment when a child's eyes lit up with understanding, when a parent learned to read their first complete sentence, when a community remembered that its children deserved better than the circumstances they were born into. The school Sarah had built with her bare hands in the Montana winter had become something far greater than she had originally envisioned. It was proof that impossible things became possible when someone cared enough to begin, persistent enough to continue, and brave enough to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. As she tucked Emma into bed in their small cabin, Sarah smiled at the thought of all the children who would learn to read in the school they had built together. Some would become teachers themselves, carrying the gift of education to other forgotten communities. Others would become leaders, inventors, artists, or simply thoughtful citizens who understood that learning never ended. The pregnant woman who had knelt in frozen earth with nothing but determination had discovered that the most important construction project wasn't the building itself. It was the building of hope. One lesson at a time, one child at a time, one community at a time. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that education could flourish anywhere people gathered with the intention to learn and grow together. And Sarah Mitchell, certified teacher and builder of dreams, would be ready for all of it. The school bell that would summon children to learning each morning sat silent on its shelf, waiting for dawn and the continuation of a story that had no ending, only the daily renewal of possibility that came with each new day of teaching and learning in the mountains of Montana. 6 months after the territorial commissioner's visit, Sarah Mitchell stood before the largest gathering Cedar Falls had seen since before the mine closure. The occasion was the first official graduation ceremony for students who had completed their primary education at what was now formally known as the Cedar Falls Community School. 15 children, ranging in age from 8 to 14, sat in the front row wearing their finest clothes and expressions of nervous pride. The transformation of the town had been as remarkable as the transformation of the school. Word of the innovative educational program had spread throughout the territory, attracting new families who wanted their children to experience the personalized learning methods Sarah had developed. The general store now stayed open 6 days a week instead of 3. A new boarding house had opened to accommodate visiting parents and territorial education officials who came to observe the teaching techniques. Most surprising of all, the abandoned copper mine had found new life. A geological survey commissioned by Rodriguez had revealed significant silver deposits in sections the original mining company had never explored. A carefully planned reopening was scheduled for the following spring, with Rodriguez as the primary investor and the promise that mining families would receive priority employment. But the true measure of the school's success sat in those 15 chairs, children who could now read fluently, solve complex mathematical problems, recite historical facts, and write essays that would have impressed educators in much larger cities. More importantly, they had developed the confidence and curiosity that would serve them throughout their lives. Emma, now 7 and serving as the school's official student assistant, stood at a small podium to address the audience. Her clear voice carried easily through the packed schoolroom. When my mama started building the school, people said it was impossible. They said a pregnant woman couldn't build anything important with her bare hands. They said children like US didn't need education because we were just poor mountain kids. Emma paused, looking directly at Marcus Whitfield, who sat in the back row with a carefully neutral expression. But my mama knew something those people didn't know. She knew that impossible just means nobody has figured out how to do it yet. And she knew that poor children dream just as big as rich children. We just need someone to teach us how to make our dreams real. The audience stirred with emotion. Sarah felt tears threatening as she watched her daughter speak with poise that would have impressed a seasoned orator. Today, these 15 students are graduating because they learned that education isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose to pursue every single day. Some of them will go on to higher education in Helena or Denver. Others will use what they've learned to build better lives right here in Cedar Falls. But all of them will remember that learning never stops, and that the most important thing any teacher can give a student is the belief that they can accomplish anything they set their minds to. Emma gestured toward Sarah. My mama built more than a school building. She built a place where dreams grow into realities. And now it's our turn to use what we've learned here to build something even better for the people who come after us. The applause was thunderous. Rodriguez, who had become an unofficial member of the school board, stood to present the formal certificates. Each graduate walked across the small stage Sarah and the older students had constructed for the ceremony, receiving their diploma and a personally written note from their teacher. When Tommy Brennan accepted his certificate, he paused to address the audience. Mrs. Mitchell taught me that being smart isn't about knowing everything. It's about knowing how to figure out what you don't know. Next fall, I'll be attending the Territorial Teachers College in Helena, and when I graduate, I plan to come back here and help teach the next group of students. Lucy followed with her own announcement. I'm going to study medicine and become a doctor. Mrs. Mitchell showed me that healing people's bodies is just as important as healing their minds, and both kinds of healing start with education. Each graduate shared similar aspirations, plans that would have seemed impossible for poor mountain children just months earlier. The school had given them more than knowledge. It had given them the ability to envision futures beyond the limitations of their circumstances. When the formal ceremony concluded, the celebration moved outside where tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in the area. Children ran between the adults, playing games and reciting poems they had memorized. Parents shared stories about the changes they had witnessed in their children's confidence and capabilities. Mrs. Kane approached Sarah carrying a wrapped package. This is from all the merchants in town, she explained. A small token of appreciation for what you've accomplished. Inside the package was a beautifully bound ledger with Cedar Falls Community School embossed in gold letters on the cover. The first page contained handwritten messages from every business owner in the area, thanking Sarah for bringing hope and prosperity back to their community. We want you to use this to record the history of the school, Mrs. Kane explained, so future students will understand how it all began. Rodriguez appeared at Sarah's elbow. carrying a cup of cider and wearing an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Have I mentioned lately that I'm amazed by what you've accomplished?" Sarah looked around at the celebration, at the children playing games that incorporated mathematical concepts, at the parents discussing books their children had recommended, at the community that had rallied around the simple idea that education could transform lives. "What I've accomplished," she replied. "Daniel, none of this would have been possible without your support and partnership." "Partnership is the right word," Rodriguez agreed. "You provided the vision and determination. One provided resources and encouragement. Together, we created something neither of us could have achieved alone." Commissioner Harrison, who had returned for the graduation ceremony, joined their conversation. "Mrs. Mitchell, I have a proposition for you. The territorial government is planning to establish 3 new community schools in remote areas. Would you be interested in training the teachers who will run them?" The offer was flattering but also overwhelming. Sarah had never imagined herself as a teacher of teachers, someone whose methods would be studied and replicated across the territory. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of responsibility," she admitted. "Mrs. Mitchell," Harrison replied, "you've demonstrated that the most important qualification for teaching is the ability to help others discover their own capabilities. That's exactly what we need in our teacher training program." Emma tugged on Sarah's skirt. "Mama, if you teach other teachers, then lots more children like us will get to go to school." The simplicity of her daughter's logic cut through Sarah's self-doubt. The methods she had developed through trial and error, necessity and determination, could help other isolated communities create their own educational opportunities. "I'll consider it," Sarah told Harrison. "But I want to continue teaching here. As well, Cedar Falls is my home, and these children are my first responsibility." "Of course. We envision you spending part of each year here and part at the Territorial Teacher Training Institute. The combination of practical experience and instructional development would benefit everyone involved." As the celebration continued into the evening, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 18 months earlier, she had been a desperate widow with no prospects and few skills, driven by little more than maternal instinct and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Now she was a certified teacher whose methods were being studied across the territory, a community leader whose school had helped revitalize an entire town, and a woman who had proven that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. But the most important transformation wasn't professional or public. It was personal. Sarah had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed, developed skills she never imagined she could learn, and found her voice as someone who could inspire others to believe in their own potential. Pastor Collins approached carrying his worn Bible and wearing the gentle smile that had comforted so many families through difficult times. "Mrs. Mitchell, I wonder if I might ask you to consider speaking at Sunday services occasionally. Your story of perseverance and faith could inspire others who are facing their own impossible circumstances." "I'm not sure I'm qualified to give religious instruction," Sarah replied. "I'm not asking you to preach theology," Collins clarified. "I'm asking you to share the practical faith you've demonstrated, the belief that working toward good outcomes is worth the effort, even when success seems unlikely." Sarah nodded slowly. "I suppose I could do that." Emma had been listening to the conversation with the intense attention she brought to all adult discussions. "Pastor Collins, does faith mean believing things will work out the way you want them to?" Collins knelt to Emma's level. "What do you think it means?" "I think it means believing that working toward good things is always right, even if you don't know how they'll turn out." Collins looked up at Sarah with amazement. "I couldn't have said it better myself." As the evening wound down and families began gathering their children for the walk home, Rodriguez helped Sarah collect the graduation certificates and ceremonial materials. The school building, lit by lanterns and filled with the lingering warmth of celebration, seemed to pulse with life and possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Rodriguez asked, noticing Sarah's contemplative mood. "About how different everything is from what I expected when I first started building this place." "Different how?" Sarah gestured around the room that had been witness to so much learning, growth, and community building. "I thought I was just trying to give Emma and a few other children the chance to learn reading and arithmetic. I never imagined it would become something that could change an entire community. The best outcomes usually exceed our initial expectations," Rodriguez observed. "That's why it's important to start working toward good goals, even when we can't see the full picture." Emma appeared beside them, carrying the school bell that had become the symbol of their educational mission. "Mama, tomorrow is Saturday. But can we still have school? Some of the little children want to practice their letters." Sarah smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. "Saturday school sounds like a wonderful idea. But maybe we could make it different from regular school. More like a club for children who love learning." "A learning club," Emma exclaimed. "Can I help teach the little ones?" "I think you'd be an excellent teacher," Rodriguez agreed. "You have the most important qualification. You care about helping others learn." As they walked home through the mountain night, Sarah reflected on the conversation she would need to have with Thomas if he ever returned from California. The woman he had left behind barely existed anymore, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, and more purposeful than she had ever imagined she could become. The pregnancy that had seemed like such a burden during those first desperate months was now entering its final stages. In a few weeks, Sarah would welcome a new child into a world dramatically different from the one Emma had been born into. This baby would grow up in a community that valued education, surrounded by people who believed in the power of learning to transform lives. Emma skipped ahead, practicing the speech she would give to the Saturday Learning Club about the importance of persistence in education. Her voice carried back to them through the clear mountain air, confident and articulate in ways that would have been impossible without the school they had built together. "Mama," Emma called back to them, "when I grow up, I want to build schools, too, not just the buildings, but the dreams that fill them." Sarah felt her heart swell with pride and hope. The greatest success of their educational experiment wasn't measured in test scores or graduation rates, but in the spark of ambition and purpose that now burned in young minds throughout the valley. The school building disappeared behind them as they crested a small hill, but its influence continued to radiate through the community like ripples in a still pond. Teachers were being trained who would carry the methods to other isolated communities. Children were developing skills and confidence that would serve them throughout their lives. Parents were rediscovering the value of education and the importance of supporting their children's intellectual growth. Most importantly, an entire community had learned that impossible circumstances could be transformed through determination, cooperation, and the simple belief that every child deserved the chance to learn and grow. As Sarah tucked Emma into bed that night, the child asked one final question that captured the essence of everything they had accomplished together. "Mama, what's the most important thing you learned from building the school?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I learned that when you're working toward something good, you're never really working alone. People will help in ways you never expected, and the results will be bigger than anything you could have imagined by yourself." Emma nodded solemnly. "And I learned that dreams are just plans that haven't been built yet." Outside their small cabin, the lights of Cedar Falls twinkled in the darkness, more lights than had shone in the valley for years, marking homes where families had chosen to stay and build rather than leave in search. The school had become more than an educational institution. It had become the heart of a community's renewal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. There would be Saturday learning clubs to organize, teacher training programs to develop, and always more children eager to discover what they could accomplish with proper guidance and encouragement. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell rested in the Satisfaction of knowing that she had taken an impossible dream and made it gloriously, undeniably real. The pregnant woman who had built a school with her bare hands in the Montana winter had proven that the most powerful force in the world wasn't wealth or authority or official recognition. It was the simple determination to begin working toward something good, one day at a time, one lesson at a time, one child at a time. The school bell that would ring tomorrow morning to call students to their Saturday learning club sat silent on its shelf, ready to summon another generation of young minds to the endless adventure of education. And in the mountains of Montana, the story continued not with an ending, but with the daily promise that learning never stops and dreams never die, as long as someone cares enough to keep building them. 2 years after that first graduation ceremony, Sarah Mitchell stood on the porch of her expanded home, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Her 18-month-old son, Benjamin, played at her feet, stacking wooden blocks with the focused intensity that seemed to run in the family. The child had never known a world without the school, never experienced the desperation that had driven its creation. Yet somehow he seemed to understand that the building across the meadow was special. The school itself had grown beyond anything Sarah could have envisioned during those early days of salvaging materials and learning construction techniques through trial and error. What had begun as a single room now sprawled across nearly an acre, with separate buildings for different age groups, a library that housed over 3,000 volumes, workshops for practical skills, and dormitories for students who traveled from distant communities to attend. Emma, now 9 and possessed of a teaching instinct that amazed visiting educators, emerged from the house carrying a basket of supplies for the day's lessons. She had developed into Sarah's most trusted assistant, capable of managing entire classes while demonstrating patience that would have impressed teachers twice her age. "Mama, the territorial inspector is coming today," Emma announced. "Mrs. Henderson says he's bringing people from the Federal Education Department in Washington." Sarah felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that accompanied high-level visits, though she had learned to trust in the strength of what they had built together. The school's reputation had spread far beyond Montana territory, attracting attention from educators and government officials who wanted to understand how a remote mountain community had achieved literacy rates higher than most major cities. "Are you worried?" Emma asked, noticing her mother's expression. "Not worried exactly," Sarah replied. "More like aware that today might bring changes we haven't prepared for." Rodriguez appeared from the direction of the school, carrying a stack of papers and wearing the expression of someone who had been awake since before dawn. His involvement in the school had evolved from helpful neighbor to unofficial administrator, managing the complex logistics of an institution that now educated over 200 students and employed 15 teachers. "The Washington delegation arrived on the morning train," he announced. "Commissioner Harrison is bringing them up the mountain road now. They should be here within the hour." Sarah handed Benjamin to Emma and smoothed her dress, a practical but well-made garment that reflected both her improved circumstances and her continued focus on function over fashion. The woman who had once worried about having enough fabric to patch her daughter's clothes now dressed with the quiet dignity of someone whose work commanded respect across the territory. "What do they want to see?" Sarah asked. "Everything," Rodriguez replied. "The teaching methods, the community integration programs, the vocational training workshops, the adult literacy classes. They're particularly interested in the agricultural education program and how it's helped families increase their crop yields." The agricultural program had been Emma's idea, born from her observation that many families struggled to grow enough food to feed themselves adequately. Working with Rodriguez and several experienced farmers, the school had developed a curriculum that combined botanical science with practical farming techniques. Students learned about soil chemistry while helping their families optimize planting schedules and crop rotation. The results had been remarkable. Family gardens that had previously yielded barely enough vegetables for summer meals now produced surplus crops that could be preserved for winter or sold to generate modest income. More importantly, children had learned to see farming as a science. Rather than mere labor, understanding how knowledge could transform even the most traditional occupations. They're also interested in the teacher training program, Rodriguez continued. Apparently, the methods developed here are being discussed at the highest levels of government as potential models for rural education throughout the country. Sarah had spent the previous summer traveling to remote communities across 3 territories, helping establish schools modeled on the Cedar Falls approach. The experience had been both exhilarating and exhausting, requiring her to adapt techniques developed in one specific context to widely varying circumstances and populations. Each community had presented unique challenges. Some were populated primarily by immigrant families who spoke little English. Others served farming communities where children's labor was essential during planting and harvest seasons. A few worked with mining families similar to Cedar Falls' original population, but dealing with different minerals and economic conditions. The common thread in every successful implementation had been the same principle that had guided Sarah's original efforts: meeting people where they were and building education around their actual needs rather than imposing abstract curricula. Designed in distant offices by people who had never lived in rural communities, Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mama, should I gather the students for the demonstration?" The demonstration had become a standard part of official visits, showcasing the school's integrated approach to education through a typical day's activities. Visitors would observe classes in session, watch students transition between academic and practical learning, and see how older students mentored younger ones. "Not yet," Sarah replied. "Let's wait until they arrive and see what they're most interested in observing." The delegation's arrival was announced by the sound of multiple carriages making their way up the winding mountain road. Sarah counted 6 vehicles, suggesting a larger group than she had expected. Her stomach tightened with the familiar anxiety that accompanied situations where her work would be judged by people whose standards and expectations remained unknown. Commissioner Harrison led the group, his familiar presence providing some comfort in what was otherwise a sea of strange faces. Behind him walked a distinguished gentleman in expensive suit, who carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to wielding significant authority. "Mrs. Mitchell," Harrison called out as they approached, "I'd like you to meet Secretary of Education William Palmer, representing the Federal Department of Education." Palmer stepped forward and extended his hand. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've traveled a considerable distance to see what you've accomplished here. The reports I've received are quite extraordinary." "I hope our work lives up to your expectations," Sarah replied, accepting his handshake with as much confidence as she could manage. "From what I observed during the journey here, you've already exceeded them," Palmer said, gesturing toward the settlements spread across the valley. "Commissioner Harrison tells me that when you began this project, Cedar Falls was essentially a ghost town. Now it appears to be a thriving community." Sarah nodded. "Education tends to attract families who want opportunities for their children. Those families create demand for businesses and services. The school didn't single-handedly revive the town, but it provided a foundation that other improvements could build on." Palmer's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a remarkably sophisticated understanding of economic development for someone who began as a... What was your background before this?" The question carried an undertone that Sarah had learned to recognize. The subtle suggestion that her success was somehow surprising given her humble origins. She had developed a standard response that acknowledged her background while asserting the validity of her expertise. "I was a miner's wife with limited formal education," Sarah replied calmly. "But I had something more valuable than credentials. I had children who needed to learn, and I was willing to figure out how to teach them." "And the building techniques?" The construction was quite impressive for someone without training in that field. Rodriguez stepped forward. Mrs. Mitchell learned construction the same way she learned teaching, by doing it, making mistakes, and improving through experience. Some of the most innovative solutions in this building came from her inexperience with traditional methods. Palmer studied the school building with obvious interest. "I'd like to see those innovations. My understanding is that you've achieved remarkable results with minimal funding. Would you like to tour the facilities first, or observe classes in session?" Sarah asked. "Classes, definitely. I want to see your methods in action." They made their way to the main academic building, where Emma was leading a group of 7 and 8-year-olds through a reading lesson that incorporated local history. The children were taking turns reading passages from a book about Montana territorial development, stopping periodically to discuss unfamiliar terms or concepts. "Now, who can tell me what territorial government means?" Emma asked. A boy named Peter raised his hand. "It's like having a practice government before you become a real state." "That's very good, Peter. Can you explain why territories need practice?" "Because governing is hard, and you need to learn how to do it right before you get to make all your own decisions." Palmer leaned over to whisper to Harrison. "How old is that teacher?" 9 years old, Harrison replied. "She's been helping with instruction since she was 6. Palmer's expression suggested he was struggling to reconcile what he was witnessing with his preconceptions about educational requirements. "And she's effective with students only slightly younger than herself. Often more effective than adult teachers," Sarah said quietly. "Children understand how other children think. Emma can explain concepts in ways that make immediate sense to her students because she remembers learning those same concepts recently." They moved to another classroom where Tommy Brennan, now 16 and returned from Teachers College for the summer, was guiding older students through advanced mathematics using practical applications from local businesses. The lesson involved calculating optimal pricing strategies for the general store, taking into account supply costs, transportation expenses, and competitive factors. "This is sophisticated economic analysis," Palmer observed. "These students are working with concepts I wouldn't expect to see until university level. When mathematics is connected to real situations that affect their families, students can handle much more complex material," Tommy explained. "Abstract concepts become concrete when they're tied to familiar problems." Palmer spent the next hour observing various classes, workshops, and student interactions. He watched 12-year-olds teaching reading to younger children, saw teenagers designing improved irrigation systems for local farms, and observed adults attending evening literacy classes taught by students who had mastered reading just months earlier. The most impressive demonstration came when a group of students presented their solution to a transportation problem that had been affecting the entire region. Working together, they had designed a more efficient routing system for supply wagons. That reduced travel time between communities by nearly 30% while cutting costs significantly. "These aren't theoretical exercises," Palmer said to Sarah as they watched the presentation. "These students are solving real problems that affect real people." "That's the foundation of everything we do here," Sarah replied. "Education should improve lives, not just fill minds with information that has no practical application." Palmer nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Mitchell, I came here expecting to see an interesting local experiment in rural education. Instead, I'm observing methods that could revolutionize how we approach learning throughout the country. I'm flattered by your assessment, but I'm not sure our methods would work everywhere. We've succeeded here because we understand this specific community and its needs. But the underlying principles, practical application, peer teaching, community integration, those could be adapted to any setting." Rodriguez joined the conversation. "Secretary Palmer, what would federal support for this type of education look like?" Palmer's response was more enthusiastic than Sarah had dared hope. "Funding for teacher training programs, assistance with building construction, support for developing curricula that could be adapted to different regions. The federal government is increasingly interested in educational approaches that produce measurable improvements in both academic achievement and economic development. Emma appeared at Sarah's side, having finished her morning teaching responsibilities. "Mr. Palmer, would you like to see what the little children have been working on?" Palmer knelt to Emma's level. "I'd be delighted, Miss Emma." Emma led them to a corner of the main building where the youngest students had constructed a detailed model of their valley, complete with miniature buildings representing every structure in the area. The model served multiple educational purposes, teaching geography, mathematics, and social studies while helping children understand their place in the larger community. "We use the model to teach about distances and directions," Emma explained, "and to talk about how communities work together. Each building has a special job, and they all need each other to make the town work properly." Palmer studied the model with fascination. "This is remarkable craftsmanship for such young children." They had help from the older students and some of the parents, Emma said. "That's how we learn here. Everyone teaches everyone else whatever they know best." "And what do you know best, Emma?" Emma considered the question seriously. "I know how to help people feel confident about learning new things. Sometimes people think they're not smart enough for education, but really they just need someone to explain things in a way that makes sense to them." Palmer straightened and looked at Sarah with an expression of amazement. "Mrs. Mitchell, your daughter has just articulated the fundamental principle of effective pedagogy. Most education professors struggle to express that concept so clearly." "Emma has had excellent teachers," Sarah replied, smiling at her daughter, "starting with the students who have taught her that learning is something you share, not something you hoard." The afternoon continued with demonstrations of the vocational training programs that had become integral to the school's mission. Students showed visitors how they had improved local blacksmithing techniques, developed more efficient food preservation methods, and created new approaches to livestock management that had increased productivity throughout the region. But the most powerful moment came when Mary, the shy girl who had joined the school in its early days, stood before the assembled visitors to present her analysis of the school's impact on the community. Now 13 and possessed of quiet confidence that would have been unimaginable in her earlier incarnation, Mary had spent months documenting changes in literacy rates, family incomes, and community cohesion. When the school opened, less than half the adults in Cedar Falls could read well enough to understand a newspaper, Mary reported. Now 94% of adults have functional literacy, and 67% have advanced reading skills. Family incomes have increased by an average of 43%, partly due to improved farming techniques and partly because people can now handle business transactions that require reading and mathematics. Palmer listened intently as Mary continued her presentation, detailing improvements in child health, reductions in family conflicts, and increases in civic participation that correlated with educational opportunities. "Most importantly, Mary concluded, we've learned that education isn't something that happens to children while adults wait for them to grow up. It's something that transforms entire communities when everyone participates in learning and teaching." After Mary's presentation, Palmer requested a private conversation with Sarah, Rodriguez, and Commissioner Harrison. They gathered in Sarah's small office, a room lined with books and student artwork that reflected the personal connection she maintained with every aspect of the school's operation. "Mrs. Mitchell," Palmer began, "I want to discuss the possibility of federal funding for expanding your model to other communities. The Department of Education is prepared to offer substantial support for teacher training programs based on your methods." Sarah felt her heart race. Federal support could mean resources to help dozens of communities create their own schools. But it might also mean loss of local control and adaptation to bureaucratic requirements that could undermine the flexibility that made their approach successful. What would federal support require? She asked carefully. Primarily documentation of your methods and training programs for teachers who would implement them elsewhere. You would retain complete autonomy over operations here while serving as a model and training center for similar programs. Rodriguez leaned forward. Would there be requirements about specific curricula or teaching credentials? Minimal requirements, Palmer assured them. The federal government is more interested in results than credentials. Your students consistently outperform their peers in traditional schools, and your community development outcomes are remarkable. We want to replicate success, not impose theoretical frameworks that haven't proven effective. Sarah looked around the office that had become the nerve center of an educational revolution she had never intended to start. The walls held pictures drawn by students, thank you letters from parents, and newspaper articles about the school's innovative methods. Each item represented lives changed and futures brightened through the simple act of refusing to accept that some children didn't deserve educational opportunities. I'll need to discuss this with the community, Sarah said finally. This school belongs to everyone who has contributed to its success. Any major decisions should reflect their input. Palmer nodded approvingly. That's exactly the response I was hoping for. The collaborative approach that makes this place special shouldn't be abandoned because of outside opportunities. Emma appeared in the doorway, having completed her afternoon responsibilities. Mama, the students want to know if Mr. Palmer would like to stay for our evening storytelling circle. Palmer's face lit up. I would be honored to attend. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and lanterns cast warm light throughout the school, Palmer sat in a circle with students ranging from 5 to 50 years old, listening to stories that wove together local history, moral lessons, and practical wisdom. Emma told a tale about a girl who learned that teaching others helped her understand subjects better than studying alone. Tommy shared a story about cooperation that drew parallels between barn raising and community building. But the most moving story came from Mrs. Henderson, a woman who had arrived in Cedar Falls illiterate and desperate, and who now served as the school's head librarian. She spoke about the transformation she had witnessed in herself and others, describing education not as the accumulation of facts but as the development of confidence to face unknown challenges. When I first came here, Mrs. Henderson said, I was ashamed that I couldn't read my own children's letters from school. Now I help other adults discover that learning isn't about proving how smart you are, it's about becoming the person you're capable of being. Palmer listened with obvious emotion as story after story revealed the human impact of educational opportunity. These weren't statistics or policy outcomes, but real people whose lives had been fundamentally changed through access to learning and the support of a community that valued growth over status. As the storytelling circle concluded and families began gathering their children for the walk home, Palmer approached Sarah with an expression of deep thoughtfulness. Mrs. Mitchell, I came here to evaluate an educational program. Instead, I've witnessed something much more significant, a demonstration that communities can solve their own problems when they're given the tools and support they need. That was never our intention, Sarah replied. We just wanted children to have the chance to learn. But that's exactly my point. You focused on meeting immediate needs rather than implementing grand theories, and you created something that exceeds what most grand theories achieve. Benjamin, who had spent the evening charming various attendees with his toddler antics, approached his mother with arms raised, ready for sleep. Sarah lifted him easily, marveling at how much her life had changed since those desperate early days when she could barely imagine surviving until the next week. What happens next? Emma asked, having overheard the conversation about federal support. Palmer knelt to Emma's level once more. What do you think should happen next? Emma considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. I think we should help other communities build schools like ours, but we should make sure they get to decide what their schools will be like. Every place is different, so every school should be different too. Palmer stood and looked at Sarah with an expression of profound respect. Mrs. Mitchell, I believe your daughter just outlined the ideal approach for educational policy at the federal level. As the visitors prepared to depart the next morning, Palmer presented Sarah with a formal letter from the Secretary of Education, offering substantial federal funding for teacher training programs and community school development. The letter emphasized that support would come without requirements that might compromise the local autonomy and community integration that made the Cedar Falls model successful. This is an extraordinary opportunity, Rodriguez observed as they watched the carriages disappear down the mountain road. It's also an extraordinary responsibility, Sarah replied. If we accept federal support, we become accountable for results. In communities we may never visit, working with people whose needs we don't fully understand. Emma, who had been unusually quiet during the morning's farewells, spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of Sarah's concerns. Mama, what if helping other places means we don't have enough time to keep making our own school better? The question crystallized Sarah's dilemma. The Cedar Falls school had succeeded because it remained small enough for personal attention and flexible enough for constant adaptation. Scaling up to serve as a national model might require sacrificing the intimate, responsive approach that made it effective. But as Sarah looked around at the community that had grown up around their educational experiment, she realized that the choice wasn't between local focus and broader impact. It was between sharing what they had learned and keeping it to themselves. Emma, she said finally, what do you think happens to good ideas when people keep them secret? They don't help anyone except the people who already have them. And what happens when people share good ideas? Emma's face brightened. They get better because other people add their own good ideas to them. Sarah smiled at her daughters. Wisdom, then I think we know what we need to do. That afternoon, Sarah sat down to write her response to the Federal Education Department, accepting their offer while proposing modifications that would protect the community-centered approach that had made their success possible. The letter emphasized that effective education required deep understanding of local needs and circumstances, and that any training program must prepare teachers to listen to their communities rather than simply implement predetermined curricula. As she wrote, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate widow to nationally recognized educator. The transformation had been gradual, built through daily choices to continue when stopping would have been easier to include. Others when working alone would have been simpler, and to trust in possibilities when evidence suggested impossibility. The pregnant woman who had knelt in frozen earth with nothing but determination had discovered that the most important construction project wasn't the building itself, it was the building of hope. One lesson at a time, one child at a time, one community at a time. Outside her window, the school that had started as an impossible dream bustled with activity as students, teachers, and community members worked together to prepare for another day of shared learning. The building itself was impressive, but the real monument to their success was less tangible: the transformation of minds, the expansion of possibilities, and the proof that communities could solve their own problems when education gave them the tools to imagine better futures. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new students eager to learn, and new communities ready to begin their own educational experiments. The story that had begun with a single mother's refusal to accept defeat had become a movement that would touch lives across the country. But tonight, as Sarah tucked Benjamin into his crib and listened to Emma practice reading to her dolls, she was content to be exactly where she was, home in the community they had built together, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction that comes from work well done and dreams transformed into reality. The school bell that would ring tomorrow morning to call students to another day of learning sat silent on its shelf, ready to summon another generation of young minds to the endless adventure of education. And in the mountains of Montana, the story continued not with an ending, but with the daily promise that learning never stops and dreams never die, as long as someone cares enough to keep building them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.